The first howl of the spring flood echoed through Sioux Falls, Dakota Territory, 1875, as Lillian Cooper's chestnut mare lost its footing on the swollen riverbank. One moment she was crossing the shallow ford she'd used 100 times before. The next, the surging waters had swallowed horse and rider whole, dragging them mercilessly downstream in a churning torrent of ice-cold snowmelt. "Help!" Lillian screamed, her voice barely audible above the roaring water. Her gloved hands clutched desperately at Maple's reins as the panicked horse fought against the current, powerful legs thrashing. The weight of her sodden riding skirt pulled her down, the freezing water stealing her breath. In those terrifying seconds, Lillian was certain she would die. Then a deep voice cut through her panic. "Hold on, I'm right here," a man on horseback thundered alongside the riverbank, keeping pace with the current that carried her. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the determination in his posture as he spurred his mount forward, angling toward a bend in the river where the current slowed. "Let go of the reins," he shouted, standing in his stirrups. "Your horse is pulling you under." "I can't," Lillian cried, coughing as water splashed into her mouth. Maple was her father's prize mare, all she had left of him, and instinct told her to hold tight. "Trust me." The stranger's voice held such conviction that something inside Lillian responded. She released the leather straps, immediately feeling herself rise higher in the water. The cowboy's horse plunged into the shallower edge of the river. In one fluid motion, he leaned from his saddle, strong arm extended. "Grab on." Lillian reached out, fingers numb with cold, and felt his calloused hand close around her wrist like iron. With a powerful heave, he pulled her from the water's grip, hauling her across his saddle. She gasped for breath, water streaming from her clothes as he turned his horse toward shore. "My horse," she managed, looking back at Maple, who was still fighting the current further downstream. "First things first," he said grimly, spurring his mount up the muddy bank. Once on solid ground, he lowered Lillian carefully to the grass. She collapsed, shivering violently as he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Stay put," he ordered, already remounting. "I'll see about your mare." Through chattering teeth, Lillian watched the stranger gallop downstream, his silhouette powerful against the evening sky. Only then did she notice the setting sun and realize how close she'd come to being lost in the darkness, as well as the flood. The stranger, a cowboy by his dress and manner, disappeared around the river bend. Minutes stretched endlessly as Lillian huddled in his coat, the smell of leather, tobacco, and horse surrounding her. The coat was warm from his body, and she pulled it tighter, willing her shivers to subside. Just when she began to fear for both her rescuer and her horse, she heard hoofbeats. The cowboy appeared, leading Maple by her reins. The mare was soaked and trembling but appeared uninjured. Relief flooded through Lillian as intensely as the river had moments before. "She's a fighter," the cowboy said, dismounting. "Found her half a mile downstream, clambering onto a sandbar." He approached Lillian, and for the first time, she clearly saw his face as he pushed his hat back. Kind eyes the color of a summer sky regarded her with concern. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. He wasn't classically handsome, but something about him made Lillian's breath catch, and not just from the cold. "Name's Nathan Morgan," he said, crouching beside her. "Most folks call me Nate." "Lillian Cooper," she replied through trembling lips. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Morgan." A ghost of a smile touched his face. "No debt, Miss Cooper, just glad I was riding by." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Night's coming. We need to get you warm and dry. My cabin's not far, just over that ridge. Can you ride?" Lillian hesitated. Proper etiquette dictated she should refuse to accompany a stranger to his home, but circumstances were far from proper, and death from exposure was a very real possibility. "I can ride," she said firmly, though her limbs felt like lead. Nate nodded, helping her to her feet. The world tilted alarmingly, but his strong hands steadied her. "I'll help you mount. Best if you ride my gelding, he's steadier. I'll take your mare." Once in the saddle, Lillian clutched the horn with white-knuckled fingers. Her soaked riding habit weighed heavily, and every inch of her body ached with cold. Nate walked beside her, leading both horses with sure hands, occasionally glancing up to make sure she remained seated. His cabin appeared as they crested the ridge, a modest structure of hewn logs with a curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney. A small corral and stable stood nearby. It was humble but well-maintained, speaking to its owner's character. "Almost there," Nate encouraged as Lillian swayed in the saddle. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness had fallen completely, and she could barely feel her fingers or toes. Nate helped her dismount, catching her weight when her knees buckled. "Let me see to the horses first," he said. "Can you make it inside? Fire's already lit." Lillian nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. She staggered to the cabin door, pushing it open to find a simple but tidy one-room dwelling. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the warmth that greeted her brought tears to her eyes. She stumbled toward it, sinking to the floor before the hearth. Nate returned quickly, shutting the door against the night chill. He moved with efficiency, adding logs to the fire before turning to Lillian. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly. "I've got some things you can wear." He crossed to a trunk, rummaging until he produced a flannel shirt and woolen trousers. "They'll be too big, but they're dry." Lillian flushed, the heat having nothing to do with the fire. "I couldn't possibly, Miss Cooper," Nate interrupted gently. "I understand propriety, but right now, you're at risk of lung fever or worse. I'll step outside while you change." His eyes, direct but respectful, held hers. "There's no one for Miles to judge, and I promise you my word as a gentleman." The sincerity in his voice decided her. Lillian nodded, accepting the clothing. True to his word, Nate stepped outside. Lillian struggled with her sodden garments, fingers clumsy with cold. Finally free of the heavy fabric, she pulled on his shirt and trousers, rolling the sleeves and pant legs to manageable lengths. The clothes smelled of sunshine and pine soap, and despite their size, felt like heaven against her chilled skin. "I'm decent," she called when finished. Nate returned, carrying a steaming pot from an outdoor fire. If he found her appearance unusual, a proper young woman in men's clothing, he gave no indication. Instead, he nodded approvingly and set about preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork. He handed her a tin cup of hot coffee laced with whiskey. "Medicinal," he explained when she hesitated. "Best thing for the chill." Lillian sipped cautiously, the liquor burning a path down her throat and spreading warmth through her center. "Thank you," she murmured, watching as he moved efficiently around the small space. "For everything, I would have drowned." Nate paused, regarding her seriously. "What were you doing crossing the river today? Spring melt makes it dangerous." "I've used that ford since I was a child," Lillian defended. "I didn't realize how high the water had risen." She sighed, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I was delivering medicines to the Larson family on the north side. Their youngest has a fever. You're a doctor." Surprise colored his voice. "A healer," she corrected. "I learned from my father. He was the doctor in Sioux Falls before he passed last winter." Pain flickered across her face. "I've been trying to maintain his practice." Understanding dawned in Nate's eyes. "Dr. Cooper. I've heard good things about him. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Lillian stared into the fire, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. "The town council doesn't believe a woman should practice medicine, but the people still come to me." Nate ladled the beans into 2 tin plates, handing one to Lillian along with a spoon. "People around here care more about results than conventions." He settled across from her, his long legs stretched toward the fire. "Eat, you need your strength." They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling and the wind occasionally gusting around the cabin's solid walls. When Lillian's eyelids began to droop, Nate stood and arranged his bedroll near the fire. "Take the bed," he said, gesturing to the simple wooden frame against the far wall. "I'll sleep here." Too exhausted to argue, Lillian murmured her thanks and crawled beneath the quilts. The pillow smelled faintly of pine and leather like Nate himself. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was wonderment at finding herself in a stranger's cabin, wearing his clothes, yet feeling safer than she had in months. When Lillian woke, sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window. For a moment, she was disoriented, memories of the previous day rushing back in a flood, almost as powerful as the one that had nearly claimed her life. Nate was already up, she realized, his bedroll neatly stowed. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon filled the cabin. She sat up, finger combing her tangled hair and trying to look somewhat presentable. "Morning," Nate greeted, turning from the small cook stove. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you." Lillian was surprised to find it true. Though her muscles ached, the bone-deep chill was gone. "I'm afraid I've imposed on your hospitality." Nate shook his head, sliding bacon onto a plate. "No imposition, not many visitors out this way." He poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Your clothes are still damp, I'm afraid. Hung them by the fire, but they're heavy things." Lillian accepted the coffee gratefully. "Where exactly are we? I don't remember seeing a cabin in this area before." "About 5 miles northeast of Sioux Falls," Nate replied, returning to the stove. "I keep to myself mostly. Been here 3 years now. As a rancher." Lillian asked, noting his capable hands as he served breakfast. A shadow crossed his face. "In a manner of speaking, I raise and train horses, sell them to the army sometimes or to settlers passing through." He brought her a plate of bacon and biscuits. "After we eat, I'll take you home." "Thank you." Lillian hesitated, then asked, "Mr. Morgan, why were you near the river yesterday?" Nate settled across from her with his own breakfast. "I check the river levels during spring melt. There's a spot where it sometimes backs up, floods my lower pasture." He shrugged. "Just happened to be there at the right time." Providence, Lillian thought, or perhaps guardian angels. Whatever the reason, she was grateful. After breakfast, Nate saddled the horses while Lillian reluctantly donned her still damp riding habit. It clung unpleasantly to her skin, but she could hardly return to town in men's clothing. "Your mare seems no worse for her adventure," Nate said as he helped Lillian mount. "She's strong-willed like her owner." Lillian felt a blush warm her cheeks at what might have been a compliment. "Maple was my father's pride. He imported her from Kentucky." They rode side by side toward Sioux Falls, the morning sun warming the spring air. Lillian found herself studying her companion surreptitiously. In daylight, Nate Morgan cut an impressive figure. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the ease of a man born to the saddle. His sandy hair was overdue for a trim, curling slightly at his collar, and his jawline was strong beneath several days' growth of beard. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, perhaps 5 or 6 years her senior. "How long have you lived in Dakota Territory?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Came here after the war," he replied. "Needed open spaces after that. You fought for the Union," Nate nodded. "New York 71st. You?" "My family remained in South Dakota throughout," Lillian answered. "My father treated soldiers from both sides. He said medicine shouldn't recognize uniforms." "Wise man." Nate's expression softened. "Is your mother still living?" Lillian shook her head. "She died when I was 14. Consumption. It's just been me since father passed." "No husband, family." Nate looked genuinely surprised. "No husband," Lillian confirmed. "As for family, well, I have an uncle in Boston who writes occasionally, suggesting I return east for a proper life." "And you haven't because?" "This is my home," Lillian said simply. "These are my people. They need a healer, even if that healer is a woman." Nate smiled then, a full smile that transformed his weather-beaten face. "Miss Cooper, I think you're exactly what Sioux Falls needs." They crested a hill, and the town spread below them, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along the river, with scattered farms and homesteads dotting the surrounding prairie. "I should warn you," Lillian said hesitantly. "There will be talk when we ride in together. People in small towns speculate." "Let them," Nate replied with an unconcerned shrug. "Truth is, you nearly drowned, I fished you out, and now I'm bringing you home. Nothing improper in that." His straightforwardness was refreshing, Lillian thought. No false modesty or concern for appearances, just honest decency. As they approached the town limits, riders appeared ahead, 3 men moving fast in their direction. Lillian recognized Sheriff Thomas and 2 of her neighbors. "Looks like someone missed you," Nate observed. The sheriff reined in hard when he reached them, relief evident on his weathered face. "Miss Cooper, thank the Lord. We've been searching since dawn. Mrs. Larson said you never arrived yesterday." "I'm fine, Sheriff," Lillian assured him. "My horse was swept away attempting to cross the river." "Mr. Morgan here saved my life." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Nate, eyes narrowing slightly. "Morgan." His tone was carefully neutral. "Didn't know you came to town much." I don't, Nate replied evenly. Just ensuring Miss Cooper returned safely. An awkward silence fell, and Lillian sensed an undercurrent between the men. The sheriff finally nodded curtly. We appreciate that. We'll take her from here. I can see myself home, Lillian interjected, disliking being discussed as though absent. Mr. Morgan has been nothing but a gentleman. Sheriff Thomas's expression softened. Of course, Miss Cooper. We were just concerned, especially after your father's passing, you being alone and all. The unspoken message was clear. A young, unmarried woman had to mind her reputation carefully in a small town. I understand, Lillian said with dignity. And I appreciate the concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to change into dry clothes and check on my patients. The sheriff tipped his hat, casting one more measuring look at Nate before he and the other men turned back toward town. You've got loyal neighbors, Nate observed when they were out of earshot. Overprotective, perhaps, Lillian sighed. Since father died, half the town treats me like I might shatter, while the other half waits for me to admit I can't manage alone. And can you? Nate asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than challenging. Lillian met his gaze directly. I've managed so far. It's not always easy, but it's my life. They reached the edge of town, where curious eyes watched their approach from storefronts and windows. Lillian directed Nate to a modest two-story house set back from the main street. A small sign beside the door read, Cooper Medical Services. This is me, she said, dismounting before Nate could assist her. Thank you again, Mr. Morgan. I owe you my life. Nate swung down from his horse, tying both mounts to the hitching post. Least I could do. He hesitated, then added, if you need anything supplies, help with repairs, I'm not far. Lillian smiled. I'll remember that. She extended her hand, and he took it, his calloused palm warm against her skin. Will you come in for tea before you ride back? She saw the moment of temptation in his eyes before he shook his head. Better not, already given the gossips enough to chew on. He released her hand reluctantly. Take care crossing rivers, Miss Cooper, Lillian, she said impulsively. My friends call me Lillian, a slow smile spread across his face. Lillian then, and I'm Nate. With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Lillian watching his retreating figure with a strange mixture of gratitude and regret. Only when he disappeared from view did she turn to enter her empty house, wondering if their paths would cross again. 3 days later, Lillian was sorting herbs in her dispensary when a knock sounded at the front door. She wiped her hands on her apron, expecting Mrs. Finch and her persistent cough. Instead, she opened the door to find Nate Morgan standing on her porch, hat in hand. Mr. Morgan, she said, surprise evident in her voice. Nate, is everything all right? Everything's fine, he assured her. I was in town for supplies and thought I'd check on you, make sure you hadn't found another river to fall into. His teasing tone brought a smile to Lillian's face. No rivers lately. Please come in. Nate ducked through the doorway, his tall frame making the entryway seem suddenly smaller. He glanced around the front room, which served as her waiting area and consulting room. Medical texts lined bookshelves, and herbs hung drying from ceiling beams. This is impressive, he said, genuine admiration in his voice. My father built it over 20 years, Lillian explained, leading him to her consulting room. Please sit. Would you like tea? Nate settled into a chair, placing his hat on his knee. Don't want to interrupt your work. Not at all, Lillian assured him. It's a quiet morning. Most of my patients come after their chores are done. She prepared tea on the small stove, acutely aware of his presence. In her father's clothes, with the emergency of the river behind them, she'd felt an easy camaraderie with Nate. Now, in her own home, she felt unaccountably nervous. I brought something for you, Nate said as she handed him a steaming cup. He reached into his coat and produced a small cloth-wrapped package. Curious, Lillian unwrapped it to find a beautifully carved wooden box with a sliding lid. Inside were compartments of various sizes. It's for your herbs and medicines, Nate explained. Noticed you using paper envelopes when you prepared those remedies. Thought this might be more practical for traveling. Lillian ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. You made this, Nate shrugged, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. Winter evenings are long, I carve to pass the time. It's beautiful, thank you. A comfortable silence fell between them as they sipped their tea. Finally, Lillian asked, "What really brought you to town today? Surely not just to deliver a box." Nate met her gaze directly. "Truthfully, I wanted to see you again." His frankness was disarming. "I've been thinking about you. Wondering how you were faring." "I'm well," Lillian replied, her heart beating a little faster. "Busy, there's always someone needing care." "And who cares for the healer?" Nate asked softly. The question caught Lillian off guard. Since her father's death, no one had really asked about her well-being, her true well-being, beyond polite inquiries that expected only positive answers. "I manage," she said finally. Nate nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I don't doubt it, but everyone needs help sometimes." Before Lillian could respond, the door opened and Mrs. Finch entered, right on schedule. The older woman stopped short at the sight of Nate, her eyes widening with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Finch," Lillian greeted her smoothly. "Right on time. Mr. Morgan was just delivering a medical supply." She gestured to the wooden box. "Nate, this is Mrs. Finch, one of my regular patients." Nate stood, offering a polite nod. "Madam, I'll leave you to your appointment." He turned to Lillian. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Cooper." "Thank you for the box," she replied, walking him to the door. In a lower voice, she added, "And for checking on me." Something flickered in his eyes, warmth, perhaps, or a question unasked. "I'll be back in town next Saturday for the livestock auction. Perhaps I could call again." "I'd like that," Lillian answered, surprising herself with her eagerness. After he'd gone, she turned to find Mrs. Finch watching with naked interest. "So that's the cowboy who rescued you," the older woman said with a knowing smile. "Handsome fellow." "He's just being neighborly," Lillian replied, knowing even as she spoke that the town gossip mill would be working overtime before sunset. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Finch agreed, not sounding convinced in the slightest. "Now about this cough." The week passed in a blur of patients and house calls. Lillian found herself using Nate's wooden box daily, thinking of him each time she packed it with medicines for her rounds. Despite her best efforts to focus on her work, she caught herself watching the road from her window, anticipating Saturday's livestock auction. When Saturday arrived, Lillian dressed with more care than usual in a blue calico dress that her father had once said matched her eyes. She pinned her dark blonde hair in a simpler style than her usual practical bun, allowing a few curls to frame her face. Examining herself in the mirror, she felt foolish, like a schoolgirl primping for a dance, but couldn't bring herself to change. The auction brought farmers and ranchers from miles around to Sioux Falls' small fairgrounds. Lillian rarely attended such events, but today she found herself wandering among the pens where horses, cattle, and other livestock awaited sale. She spotted Nate almost immediately. He stood out in the crowd, taller than most, with an ease of movement that drew the eye. He was examining a bay gelding, running experienced hands down its legs and speaking with the owner. Lillian hesitated, suddenly unsure. He was clearly conducting business. Perhaps her presence would be an intrusion. Before she could decide whether to approach, Nate looked up and saw her. His face broke into a smile that transformed his features, and he excused himself from the horse trader to cross the dusty ground toward her. "Miss Cooper," he greeted, removing his hat. "I was hoping you might come." "Dr. Cooper," a voice interrupted them as Tom Peterson, one of the town councilmen, approached with his wife. "I was hoping to find you. Martha's headaches have returned." "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Peterson," Lillian replied, shifting smoothly into her professional demeanor. "Have you been using the willow bark tea I prepared?" "Yes, but it's not helping as it did before," the older woman complained. "Come by on Monday and I'll prepare something stronger," Lillian promised. "In the meantime, try cool compresses on your forehead and neck when the pain begins." As the Petersons moved on, Nate remarked, "You really are the town doctor." "Some accept it more readily than others," Lillian acknowledged. "Councilman Peterson was initially against a woman continuing my father's practice, but his wife refused to see anyone else." Nate chuckled. "Wise woman." He glanced around at the crowded fairgrounds. "Have you eaten? The church ladies have set up a food stand." The invitation was casual, but Lillian recognized it for what it was, a public acknowledgement of their friendship. Was that the right word for the tentative connection forming between them? "I haven't eaten," she admitted. That sounds lovely. They made their way to the stand where the Ladies' Aid Society served plates of fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie. Several heads turned as they passed, and Lillian heard the murmur of whispers. Nate seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Wilson, the minister's wife, greeted him with obvious surprise as they approached the food table. "We don't often see you at town gatherings. Auction brings me in, madam," Nate replied politely, "looking for a new stud for my breeding program." "I see, Mrs. Wilson's gaze shifted meaningfully to Lillian. "And you ran into our Dr. Cooper." "Actually, we arranged to meet," Nate said smoothly, handing over coins for 2 plates of food. "Miss Cooper saved my favorite mare last winter. Least I can do is buy her dinner." The simple explanation, delivered with such easy confidence, left Mrs. Wilson momentarily speechless. Lillian bit back a smile, accepting the plate Nate offered. They found seats at the end of a long table, somewhat apart from the other diners. As they ate, Nate asked about her practice, listening with genuine interest as Lillian described her patients and challenges. "The hardest part is getting people to trust me," she confided. "Some still think a woman doesn't have the constitution for medicine. Yet you persevere," Nate observed. "What choice do I have? The nearest doctor is in Yankton, almost 100 miles away." "You could have sold the practice, moved east to your uncle in Boston." Nate studied her with those perceptive blue eyes. "Why stay?" Lillian considered the question. "This is where I belong. These people, this land, it's home." She looked at him curiously. "What about you? What brought you to Dakota Territory?" A shadow crossed Nate's face. "After the war, I couldn't settle back into city life. Too many memories, too many ghosts." He took a sip of coffee. "Came west looking for space to breathe." "And did you find it?" His expression softened. "Most days." Something in his tone hinted at deeper wounds, but Lillian didn't press. Everyone in this territory carried their own burdens, their own reasons for seeking the frontier's promise of fresh beginnings. After they finished eating, Nate asked, "Would you like to see the horses I'm considering?" They spent the next hour wandering among the livestock pens, Nate pointing out qualities he looked for in breeding stock. Lillian found herself fascinated by his knowledge and the gentle way he handled even the most spirited animals. "You have a gift," she observed after watching him calm a nervous mare with just his voice and touch. "Have you always worked with horses?" "My grandfather raised them in New York State," Nate explained. "Taught me everything I know before I was 12. A reminiscent smile touched his lips. He used to say horses are like people, they just want to be understood and treated with respect. As afternoon waned, Nate purchased a promising 2-year-old colt and arranged for delivery to his property the following week. The auction crowds began to disperse as families headed home before dark. "May I walk you home?" Nate asked as they left the fairgrounds. Lillian nodded, acutely aware of the curious glances that followed them down the main street. They walked slowly, extending their time together, talking of small things, the spring weather, the prospects for summer crops, books they'd both read. At her gate, Nate paused. "I enjoyed today, Lillian." "So did I." She hesitated, then added, "Would you like to come to Sunday dinner tomorrow?" "Nothing fancy, but I always make too much for just myself." Something like surprise, followed by pleasure, crossed his face. "I'd be honored." 2 o'clock then? Nate nodded, placing his hat back on his head. 2 o'clock. As Lillian watched him walk away, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation filled her. She was inviting complications into her carefully ordered life, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt truly alive. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Lillian attended church as usual, trying to ignore the speculative glances from her neighbors. News traveled fast in small towns, and her afternoon at the auction with Nate Morgan had clearly become the latest subject of interest. After the service, Reverend Wilson stopped her at the door. "Miss Cooper, a moment of your time." With a sinking feeling, Lillian stepped aside to speak with him. The minister was a good man at heart, but firmly traditional in his views. "I understand you've been keeping company with Nathan Morgan," he began without preamble. "We're acquaintances, Reverend," Lillian replied carefully. "He saved my life during the flooding." "Yes, quite heroic," the minister acknowledged. However, I feel obligated to mention that Mr. Morgan has a complicated reputation in these parts. Lillian kept her expression neutral. In what way? Reverend Wilson lowered his voice. He arrived here under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Sheriff Thomas has mentioned that Morgan served time in a military prison after the war, something about insubordination or worse. The war affected many men in different ways, Lillian replied, thinking of the patients her father had treated for battle melancholy and soldier's heart. Mr. Morgan seems an honorable man to me. I'm sure he does, the minister said, his tone suggesting doubt. I merely thought you should be aware, given your position in the community, a doctor, even a lady doctor, must maintain a certain standing. Lillian straightened her shoulders. Thank you for your concern, Reverend. I'll keep it in mind. She managed a polite smile. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have dinner preparations waiting. As she walked home, Lillian's mind whirled with questions. What had Nate done during the war? Why had no one mentioned his past before? And most importantly, did it matter to her? By 2 o'clock, Lillian had prepared a simple but satisfying meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and early spring greens from her garden. She just removed an apple pie from the oven when a knock sounded at the door. Nate stood on her porch, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt under his usual vest. His hat was in his hands, and in the crook of his arm he carried a small bouquet of wild prairie flowers. These are for you, he said, offering the blossoms with a hint of self-consciousness. Found them on the ride in. Lillian accepted the flowers, touched by the gesture. They're beautiful, thank you. She stepped back. Please come in. Nate ducked through the doorway, seeming too large for the modest house. He glanced around with interest, taking in the combined living space and kitchen. It smells wonderful, he said appreciatively. Nothing fancy, Lillian replied, arranging the flowers in a jar of water. But I hope you're hungry. Always am for home cooking. They settled at the small table by the window, and Lillian served the meal. Conversation flowed easily between them, but she could sense Nate watching her, perhaps noticing her slight preoccupation. Something on your mind? He asked finally, setting down his fork. Lillian hesitated, then decided on directness. Reverend Wilson spoke to me after church today, about you. Nate's expression didn't change, but she noticed his shoulders tense slightly. Did he now? And what did the good Reverend have to say? He mentioned you might have had some trouble after the war, something about a military prison. Lillian met his gaze steadily. I don't put much stock in gossip, but I'd rather hear the truth from you. For a long moment, Nate was silent, and Lillian feared she'd overstepped. Then he sighed, pushing his plate aside. It's no secret, though I don't advertise it, he said finally. I spent 8 months in a military prison at Fort Leavenworth. His eyes, when they met hers, were defiant but also wary, as if expecting judgment. I struck a superior officer who ordered my men into what I knew was an ambush. We'd already lost half our company to poor decisions from commanders who'd never seen combat. What happened? Lillian asked softly. I was court-martialed. The fact that I was right about the ambush proven when another company was decimated following those same orders probably saved me from a firing squad. His mouth twisted in a grimace. Instead, I got prison time and a dishonorable discharge. I'm sorry, Lillian said, and meant it. She could see the pain behind his matter-of-fact recounting. Nate shrugged, but the casualness seemed forced. It was a long time ago. Most days I don't think about it anymore. But some days you do, Lillian guessed. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of shared wounds. Some days, Nate acknowledged quietly. He straightened, his tone becoming more businesslike. Now you know why some folks in town keep their distance. Ex-soldier with a dishonorable discharge doesn't inspire confidence. I think saving a drowning woman says more about your character than any military record, Lillian replied firmly. A ghost of a smile touched Nate's lips. You might be in the minority there. It wouldn't be the first time. Lillian rose to fetch the pie cooling on the windowsill. Being a female doctor puts me at odds with convention already. Perhaps we outcasts should stick together. Nate watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Is that what we're doing, sticking together? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken possibilities. Lillian felt her cheeks warm as she set the pie on the table. "I'd like to think we're becoming friends at the very least," she said carefully. "Friends," Nate repeated, as if testing the word. "I haven't had many of those since the war." "Well, you have one now," Lillian assured him, serving a generous slice of pie onto his plate, "whether Reverend Wilson approves or not." Nate's laugh was unexpected and rich, transforming his serious features. "Lillian Cooper, you are not what I expected when I pulled you from that river." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "Definitely good," he assured her, his eyes warm with admiration. "Definitely good." As spring melted into summer, Lillian found herself looking forward to Nate's increasingly regular visits. He began bringing patients to her ranch hands with injuries, travelers passing through his property in need of medical attention. Sometimes he would arrive with game for her larder or vegetables from his garden, always with some practical reason that fooled neither of them. For her part, Lillian discovered excuses to ride in the direction of his ranch, checking on outlying patients, gathering herbs that supposedly grew best in that area. She told herself these detours were simply practical breaking the isolation of her work, but she couldn't deny the quickening of her pulse whenever she caught sight of his cabin in the distance. On a sweltering July afternoon, Lillian was returning from visiting elderly Mrs. Peterson when a summer thunderstorm broke with startling suddenness. Within minutes, rain poured in blinding sheets and thunder crashed overhead. Maple, normally steady, grew skittish at the lightning. Nate's ranch was closer than town, so Lillian turned toward it, hunching against the driving rain. By the time she reached his cabin, she was soaked through, her riding habit plastered to her skin and water streaming from her hat brim. She had barely dismounted when the cabin door flew open, and Nate rushed out, concern evident on his face. "Lillian, what are you doing out in this?" He took Maple's reins, leading both horse and rider to the shelter of the small stable. "You're drenched." "I was caught unprepared," Lillian admitted, teeth chattering despite the summer heat. "The storm came so suddenly." Once inside the stable, Nate helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. He unsaddled Maple quickly, rubbing the horse down with straw while Lillian tried unsuccessfully to wring water from her skirts. "Come inside," Nate urged when he'd finished. "You need dry clothes." They dashed through the downpour to the cabin. Inside, the familiar single room welcomed her with its comforting simplicity. A fire crackled in the hearth despite the season, taking the damp chill from the air. "Here." Nate handed her the same flannel shirt and trousers she'd worn after the river incident. "They're clean." "Change while I make coffee." With a grateful nod, Lillian stepped behind the privacy screen in the corner, a new addition since her last visit, she noticed. As she struggled out of her sodden clothing, she heard Nate moving about the cabin, the familiar sounds of coffee being prepared, wood being added to the fire. The borrowed clothes were as comfortable as she remembered, smelling of sunshine and the herb sachets she'd given him to keep moths away. Emerging from behind the screen, she found Nate studiously focused on the coffee pot, giving her space and dignity. "Thank you," she said, hanging her wet garments near the fire. "Again, you've rescued me from a drenching." "Becoming a habit," he replied with a gentle smile, handing her a steaming cup. "Though I think you might be following rivers into trouble on purpose now." His teasing tone lightened the moment, and Lillian laughed. "Perhaps I enjoy being rescued by handsome cowboys." The words slipped out before she could consider them, and a flush rose to her cheeks. Nate's eyebrows rose, but pleasure warmed his eyes. "Is that what I am? Handsome?" "Among other things," Lillian replied, recovering her composure with a sip of coffee. Nate moved to the window, watching the storm rage outside. "You'll be staying for a while, I think. This doesn't look to be letting up soon." Lillian joined him at the window, conscious of his proximity. "I should have checked the sky more carefully before starting home." "I'm glad you didn't," Nate said quietly. Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken. Lillian was acutely aware of him, the clean scent of his soap, the way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders, the gentle strength in hands that could break a wild horse yet treated her with such care. "Nate," she began, uncertain what she meant to say. He set his cup down deliberately, turning to face her fully. Lillian, I need to speak plainly. I'm not good with flowery words or courtship rituals. Her heart stuttered in her chest. Plain speaking suits me fine. These past months, getting to know you, it's been the best time I've had since before the war. His voice was steady, but she could see the vulnerability beneath. I find myself thinking about you when you're not here, looking for excuses to see you when you are. I think about you too, Lillian admitted softly. More than I probably should. Nate took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body. I'm not the most eligible match in Dakota Territory. I have a past that makes people wary, and I don't have much beyond my horses and this cabin. I don't care about any of that. You should, he insisted gently. You're respected in town despite being a woman doctor. Being associated with me could damage that. Lillian shook her head. I make my own decisions about who deserves my respect and my affection. Something kindled in Nate's eyes at the word affection. Slowly, as if afraid she might pull away, he raised his hand to her face, fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. May I kiss you, Lillian Cooper? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers gently at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength beneath her fingertips. When they finally parted, Lillian was breathless, her heart racing. Nate rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. I've been wanting to do that since I pulled you from that river, he confessed. Even with me half drowned and bedraggled, Lillian asked with a small laugh. Even then. His smile was tender. You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, all fire and determination, even when the current nearly had you. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cabin's walls, a different kind of tempest had begun, one that had been building between them for months. As the afternoon deepened into evening, they talked of everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams, discovering each other in the soft firelight. When the rain finally ceased near dusk, Lillian knew she should return to town before darkness fell, but found herself reluctant to leave the warmth of Nate's presence. I should go, she said finally, standing to retrieve her still damp riding habit. People will wonder where I am. Nate rose as well, his expression troubled. It's getting dark, the trails will be muddy and treacherous. I've ridden worse, Lillian assured him, though the prospect wasn't appealing. Stay, Nate said suddenly. I'll sleep in the stable, you can have the cabin to yourself. Lillian hesitated, knowing what such an arrangement would look like to others, but also knowing that returning to town in the dark carried genuine dangers. What about my reputation? She asked, only half joking. Nate's expression grew serious. I would never do anything to harm that. But I would never forgive myself if something happened to you on the trail either. He took her hand gently. Stay tonight. I'll ride with you at first light, and we'll face whatever gossip comes together. His words, "will face whatever comes together," resonated within her. How long had she been facing everything alone? Since her father's death, certainly, but in truth, longer than that. Even when her father was alive, Lillian had stood apart, the female doctor, neither fully accepted in men's professional world nor fitting neatly into women's domestic sphere. Together, she repeated softly, I like the sound of that. The relief in Nate's eyes was evident. He squeezed her hand, then released it. Good, it's settled then. He gathered a few items from around the cabin. I'll be in the stable if you need anything. Before he reached the door, Lillian called his name. When he turned, she crossed to him and stood on tiptoe to press a kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. His smile warmed her more than the fire. Sleep well, Lillian. True to his word, Nate escorted Lillian back to Sioux Falls at dawn. They rode side by side, enjoying the fresh, washed morning and each other's company, speaking little but exchanging glances that said much. As they approached town, Lillian braced herself for the inevitable attention their arrival would attract. Sure enough, Mrs. Wilson was sweeping her front steps as they rode past, and her broom stilled mid-stroke at the sight of them. Like facing a firing squad, Nate murmured with a wry smile. Chin up, soldier, Lillian replied lightly. We've done nothing wrong. When they reached her home, Nate dismounted to help her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "When can I see you again?" he asked quietly. "Come for dinner tomorrow," Lillian suggested. "I'll be making stew. I'll be here." Nate hesitated, then added, "Lillian, about last night, thank you for being a gentleman," she interrupted gently, "and for caring about my safety more than appearances." Relief softened his features. "Always." With a tip of his hat, Nate remounted and rode away, leaving Lillian to face the curious stares of her neighbors alone. She held her head high as she entered her house, knowing the whispers would follow but finding, to her surprise, that she cared far less than she might have expected. Over the following weeks, Nate became a regular visitor to Lillian's home. They made no secret of their growing attachment, though they maintained propriety in public. Still, tongues wagged in Sioux Falls. "The doctor's daughter and that ex-soldier," Lillian overheard Mrs. Finch saying to another patient in her waiting room. "Can you imagine? Her poor father must be turning in his grave." "I think it's romantic," the younger woman replied. "He saved her life after all, like something from a novel." "Nothing romantic about scandal," Mrs. Finch sniffed. "Mark my words, no good will come of it." Lillian cleared her throat as she entered, and both women had the grace to look embarrassed. She treated them with her usual professionalism, though her cheeks burned with a mixture of anger and hurt. That evening, when Nate arrived for their usual Friday dinner, he found her uncharacteristically quiet. "Something's troubling you," he observed as they washed dishes together afterward. "Is it something I've done?" Lillian shook her head. "Not you, just people, their opinions." Understanding dawned in Nate's eyes. "Ah, you've been hearing talk." "It shouldn't matter," Lillian said, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary vigor. "I've never cared what people thought before." "But it's different when it involves someone you care about," Nate finished for her. He gently took the plate from her hands, setting it aside to face her. "Lillian, if our association is causing you difficulties, don't you dare suggest we stop seeing each other," she interrupted fiercely. "That's not what I want at all." Relief flooded his features. "Good. Because I don't think I could stay away from you now if I tried." He took her soapy hands in his. "But I hate that you're facing censure because of me." Lillian squeezed his fingers. "People will always find something to disapprove of. Last year it was a woman practicing medicine. Now it's who I choose to court. Next year it will be something else entirely." "Is that what we're doing, courting?" Nate asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "Aren't we?" Lillian countered. Suddenly uncertain in answer, Nate reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I've been carrying this for 2 weeks now, waiting for the right moment." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "Nate, I love you, Lillian Cooper," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since you stood dripping on my cabin floor, arguing that you could manage perfectly well on your own." His eyes held hers, earnest and vulnerable. "I'm asking if you might consider managing life with me instead." Joy bubbled up within Lillian, unexpected and overwhelming. "Are you asking me to marry you, Nathan Morgan?" "I am." He took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been that long, and I know there will be talk. I know your practice keeps you here in town while my ranch is outside it. I know there are 100 practical reasons to say no. But I also know that I love you, and I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you." The smile that broke across Nate's face was like sunrise. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. Their laughter mingled as he spun her around the small kitchen. When he set her down, his expression grew serious again. "Are you certain? People will talk even more." "Let them," Lillian said firmly. "I'm tired of living my life according to others' expectations. My father taught me to follow my heart and my conscience, and both are pointing firmly at you, Nathan Morgan." The kiss that followed sealed their promise to each other, regardless of what the future might hold. They decided on a simple ceremony in late September, when the prairie grasses turned gold and the harvest was complete. Despite Lillian's expectations of continued disapproval, the town's reaction to their engagement surprised her. While some, like Reverend Wilson and Mrs. Finch, maintained a frosty politeness, many others offered genuine congratulations. About time you found someone, Sheriff Thomas told her gruffly. Your father would have wanted that. Even Nathan Morgan, Lillian asked, unable to resist. The sheriff's weathered face softened slightly. Morgan's rough around the edges, but he's proven himself a man of character these past years. Keeps to himself, works hard, helps neighbors when needed. He cleared his throat. Besides, any man who'd dive into a flooded river after a stubborn woman clearly has the patience needed for marriage. Lillian laughed, touched by the unexpected approval. They faced a more practical challenge in deciding where to live after the wedding. Nate's ranch was too far from town for Lillian to maintain her practice, while her house in town was too far from his horses and livelihood. I've been thinking, Nate said one evening as they sat on her porch swing watching the sunset. What if we build a new place, halfway between town and my current cabin? Lillian considered the idea. That could work. Close enough for patients to reach me, but near enough to your grazing land. We could design it together, Nate continued, warming to the subject. A proper surgery room for you, stables for the horses, room to grow. He glanced at her sideways. Room for a family someday, if you want that. Lillian leaned against his shoulder, a vision of the future unfolding before her. I do want that. Very much. Construction began immediately, with Nate and several hired hands working through early autumn to complete the main structure before winter. Lillian divided her time between her practice and planning their new home, choosing finishes and furnishings with a joy she hadn't expected to find in domestic matters. As their wedding day approached, Lillian found herself increasingly reflective. One evening, after a long day of patience, she visited her parents' graves in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The sunset painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold as she knelt between the simple markers. I wish you could have met him, Father, she said softly. I think you would have liked him. He's strong and kind, and he respects my work. She traced the letters of her father's name on the weathered stone. He makes me happier than I thought possible after losing you. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Nate stood a respectful distance away, hat in hand. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said. I stopped by your house, and Mrs. Peterson said I might find you here. Lillian rose, brushing grass from her skirts. Just having a talk with my parents, telling them about you. Nate approached, standing beside her to look down at the graves. I hope they would have approved. They would have, Lillian said with certainty. My father believed in judging people by their actions, not their circumstances. And my mother, she smiled at the memory. She always said she wanted me to find someone who would see me clearly and love me anyway. I do see you clearly, Nate said, taking her hand. Your strength, your stubbornness, your compassion, and I love every part. Lillian leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. 3 more days, she murmured. 3 more days until you're stuck with me forever, Nate agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. No turning back then, Dr. Cooper. I wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Morgan. Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Lillian dressed in her mother's wedding gown, carefully preserved for 25 years. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but Mrs. Peterson's skillful alterations had transformed it into a garment that complemented Lillian's slender figure. Without family to attend her, Lillian had asked Mrs. Peterson to help her prepare. The older woman fussed over her like a mother hen, arranging her hair and securing the veil with pearl-tipped pins. You look beautiful, my dear, Mrs. Peterson said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Like an angel. I feel more nervous than angelic, Lillian admitted, smoothing the gown's skirt. Is that normal? Completely normal, the older woman assured her. I fainted clean away at my own wedding. Poor Mr. Peterson had to catch me before I hit the floor. Lillian laughed, grateful for the distraction. I'll try to remain conscious at least. See that you do. That young man of yours looks sturdy, but I'm not sure even he could catch you in all those petticoats. A knock at the door announced Sheriff Thomas, who had offered to escort Lillian to the church in her father's absence. The lawman's usual gruffness had given way to an almost paternal solemnity as he offered his arm. Your father would be proud today, he said as they walked toward the small church. He always said you had more spine than most men he knew, takes spine to follow your heart against convention. The church was fuller than Lillian had expected. It seemed the entire town had turned out, whether from genuine goodwill or simple curiosity. She barely noticed them, however, her attention fixed on Nate, who stood at the altar looking both terrified and elated in a new black suit. Reverend Wilson, who had gradually softened his opposition to their match, conducted the ceremony with surprising warmth. When Nate slipped the simple gold band onto Lillian's finger beside her mother's engagement ring, his hands trembled slightly. Lillian's voice was steady as she recited her vows, her eyes never leaving Nate's face. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Wilson declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Nate's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and when they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, Lillian felt a sense of rightness that transcended all the difficulties that had preceded this moment. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful, with tables set up outside the church where the Ladies' Aid Society had prepared a feast. Even Mrs. Finch unbent enough to wish them well, though she couldn't resist adding, "I still say it's unconventional, but then, you've never been one for convention, have you, Dr. Cooper?" "It's Dr. Morgan now," Lillian corrected gently. "Or at least, it will be on my new practice sign." As the afternoon waned, Nate and Lillian departed in his wagon, now laden with wedding gifts and Lillian's personal belongings. They would spend their first weeks of marriage in Nate's cabin while construction on their new home was completed. "Are you happy, Mrs. Morgan?" Nate asked as they left town behind, the setting sun gilding the prairie grasses around them. Lillian leaned against his shoulder, watching the familiar landscape roll by with new eyes. "Completely," she assured him. "And you, Mr. Morgan, any regrets about fishing a stubborn woman from the river?" "Only that I didn't do it sooner." He wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "Though I'm still not convinced you didn't fall in on purpose, just to ensnare me," Lillian laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "If I'd known you were waiting downstream, I might have." Their new life together began in earnest as autumn deepened toward winter. Nate continued to work on their house while Lillian maintained her practice, riding to town 3 days a week and seeing patients at the cabin on others. The arrangement required adjustment from both of them, Nate accustoming himself to sharing his solitary space, Lillian learning to balance her medical obligations with her new role as a wife. "You work too hard," Nate observed one evening as Lillian returned from a difficult birth that had kept her away for nearly 2 days. "You need rest," says the man who's been building a house from dawn to dusk, Lillian countered, sinking gratefully into a chair while he prepared a simple meal. "The baby came early, and Mrs. Johnson is so small I was worried. But all is well," Nate asked, setting a plate before her, mother and daughter both thriving. Lillian's tired face lit with the satisfaction she always felt after a successful delivery. Her husband cried when I placed the baby in his arms, said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Nate's expression softened as he watched her. "He's right, there's nothing more beautiful than new life." He hesitated, then added carefully, "I hope someday I'll hold our child that way." The simple statement caught Lillian off guard. They had spoken of children in the abstract someday, eventually, but something in Nate's tone suggested his thoughts had become more concrete. "Is that something you want soon?" she asked, setting down her fork. Nate shrugged, suddenly seeming self-conscious. "Whenever it happens, just watching you work so hard, I sometimes worry about the toll it takes. A baby would be one more demand on your strength." Lillian reached across the table to take his hand. "My work gives me strength, it doesn't deplete it." "And yes, a baby would change things, but that doesn't mean I fear the change," she smiled. "Actually, I look forward to it when it happens." Relief washed over Nate's features. "So do I." As winter descended on the Dakota Prairie, their new home neared completion. The 2-story structure stood halfway between town and Nate's original cabin, with a designated surgery room for Lillian's practice, a proper kitchen, 3 bedrooms upstairs, and stables for their horses. Nate had insisted on large windows to capture the prairie light, and a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides of the house. "It's perfect," Lillian breathed when they finally moved in, just before Christmas. Snow blanketed the landscape, but inside, warmth radiated from the massive stone fireplace Nate had built at the center of the house. Better than I imagined. It's a proper home for a doctor and a horse trainer, Nate said, pride evident in his voice. Room to grow. They celebrated their first Christmas together in their new home, inviting the Petersons and Sheriff Thomas for dinner. The house seemed to come alive with conversation and laughter, and Lillian realized how much she'd missed the sense of community during her months of grief after her father's death. As winter gave way to spring, Lillian found herself increasingly fatigued. At first, she attributed it to the demands of rebuilding her practice in a new location, but when she began experiencing morning sickness, she recognized the true cause. She confirmed her suspicions before sharing the news with Nate, wanting to be certain. On a mild April evening, as they sat on their new porch watching the sunset, Lillian took her husband's hand. "I have something to tell you," she began, suddenly nervous despite her certainty of his reaction. Nate turned to her, concern crossing his features at her serious tone. "What is it?" "Are you unwell?" "Not exactly," Lillian smiled, placing his hand against her still flat abdomen. "I'm going to have a baby, in November, I think." For a moment, Nate stared at her in stunned silence. Then his face transformed with such joy that Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "We're going to have a baby." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of glass. When he drew back, Lillian was startled to see tears in his eyes as well. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted hoarsely. "After the war, after prison, I never thought I deserved a family of my own." "You deserve every happiness," Lillian said fiercely, framing his face with her hands, "and I intend to spend my life making sure you have it." As her pregnancy progressed, Lillian adjusted her practice, limiting house calls and relying more on patients coming to her. Nate hovered protectively, much to her mingled amusement and exasperation. "I'm pregnant, not made of porcelain," she reminded him after he insisted on carrying her medical bag one too many times. "Humor me," he replied, unrepentant. "I've waited too long for this family to take chances with either of you." By autumn, Lillian's rounded figure made horseback riding impractical. She confined herself largely to their home, seeing patients in her surgery room and preparing for the baby's arrival. Nate expanded his horse training business, his reputation for gentle but effective methods spreading throughout the territory. On a bitterly cold November night, with snow piling against the windows, Lillian went into labor. Despite her medical knowledge, or perhaps because of it, she found herself afraid in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I need Mrs. Peterson," she told Nate through gritted teeth as another contraction gripped her. "She's delivered more babies than I have." Without hesitation, Nate bundled himself against the storm and rode for town, returning 2 hours later with not only Mrs. Peterson, but also the sheriff, who had insisted on accompanying them through the blizzard. "Can't have Morgan losing his way in this weather," Sheriff Thomas explained gruffly, stomping snow from his boots. "Not with a baby coming." Mrs. Peterson took command of the situation with quiet efficiency, shooing the men downstairs while she attended to Lillian. The labor progressed steadily through the night, and as dawn broke, Lillian's cries of pain gave way to a new sound, the lusty wail of a newborn. "You have a son," Mrs. Peterson announced, placing the swaddled infant in Lillian's arms. "A fine, healthy boy." Exhausted but radiant, Lillian gazed down at her child, a perfect miniature with Nate's strong jaw and a thatch of dark hair. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "Shall I bring his father up?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her usual briskness softened with emotion. At Lillian's nod, the older woman went to fetch Nate. He entered the room cautiously, his face pale with the strain of waiting, then transformed with awe as he beheld his wife and son. "Lillian," he breathed, crossing to the bedside and kneeling. "You did it." "We did it," she corrected gently, shifting the bundle so he could see the baby's face. "Meet your son." With trembling hands, Nate accepted the infant, cradling him with such tenderness that Lillian's heart seemed to expand with love for them both. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your father." His voice broke on the word, and he looked up at Lillian with tear-filled eyes. "What shall we call him? I was thinking William after my father, Lillian suggested. William Nathan Morgan. Perfect, Nate agreed, gazing back at his son. Welcome to the world, William Nathan Morgan. You are very, very loved. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. William, called Will by his father and Billy by the townsfolk, grew into a sturdy boy with his mother's inquiring mind and his father's affinity for horses. At 3, he could already sit a gentle pony, guided by Nate's protective hands. Lillian's practice flourished, her reputation extending beyond Sioux Falls to surrounding settlements. Mothers came from miles around to have her attend their births, and her remedies for common ailments were sought after throughout the territory. Nate's horse breeding business likewise prospered. The Morgan horses became known for their intelligence, strength, and even temperament, fetching premium prices from the army and wealthy ranchers alike. When Will was 4, Lillian gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose, after Nate's mother. Maggie, as she was called, arrived with less drama than her brother but twice the determination, making her presence known with robust cries that Nate claimed could be heard all the way to town. She has your spirit, he told Lillian as they watched their daughter sleep in her cradle. Heaven help us when she's grown. Heaven help the man who tries to tell her what she can't do, Lillian agreed with a smile. As their children grew, so did the community around them. What had begun as an isolated homestead gradually became a small settlement, with several families building nearby. Nate and Lillian's home became a gathering place for celebrations and emergencies, like a doctor, and a respected horseman being valuable neighbors on the frontier. On the 10th anniversary of the day Nate pulled Lillian from the river, they stood together on their porch, watching 8-year-old Will race his pony across the pasture while 4-year-old Maggie chased butterflies in the garden. Did you ever imagine this? Lillian asked, leaning against her husband's side. That day when you saw a foolish woman being swept downstream, Nate's arm tightened around her waist. Never in my wildest dreams, he admitted. I was just trying to prevent a tragedy. Instead, I found everything I never knew I wanted. Lillian turned in his embrace to face him. The years had added silver threads to his sandy hair and deepened the laugh lines around his eyes, but he was still the same man who had reached out to her that fateful day, strong, honorable, and unfailingly kind. You know, she said thoughtfully, people still tell that story in town. Remember when the Cooper girl was pulled into the river by her horse and that Morgan fellow shouted, "Hold on, I'm right here." And you did, Nate said softly. You held on to me, to us. Best decision I ever made, Lillian replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. And I intend to keep holding on for at least 50 more years. Nate's laugh was warm against her lips. That's a promise I expect you to keep, Dr. Morgan. As the sun set over the Dakota Prairie, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the Morgan family gathered on their porch, doctor, horseman, and their 2 children, bound together by love that had begun with a chance rescue on a flooded river. It wasn't the life either Nate or Lillian had envisioned for themselves, but it was infinitely better than anything they could have planned. And when Will asked, as he often did, for the story of how his parents met, Nate would begin. It was the spring flood of 1875, and your mother's horse pulled her into the river. While Lillian watched her husband's face, remembering the moment his voice had cut through her panic with those simple, life-changing words. Hold on, I'm right here. Years later, long after their children had grown and had families of their own, Nate and Lillian would still walk hand in hand along the river where their story began. And though time changed many things, one truth remained constant. From the moment he reached for her in those swirling waters, Nate had never let go, and Lillian had never stopped holding on.